This slideshow is about medieval European theater in the British Isles and the European continent, and it really covers a broad span of time from 900 Common Era to 1500 Common Era. So we are talking about a long stretch of time, and there's no way I can touch on everything. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief overview over these slides, and just point out some things to you and then ask you to do more close research on these slides. So the earliest evidence we have of medieval drama taking place, the actual performance of drama, is in Catholic churches, the cathedrals and monasteries. The earliest records we have of this is in the 10th century Common Era. In that time, church ritual was a bit different than it is today as far as the Catholic Church is concerned. Church ritual was divided into two parts. There was a Mass, which is a strictly observed ritual, and then there were what were called hours. Those are flexible times, and sometimes drama could take place within the cathedral during this portion of the worship day. We know that in 925, there was an Easter Mass that included a play in which angels asked there are three separate Marys in the Bible who come to the tomb of Jesus in order to cleanse his body and wrap him after his death. And when they show up at the tomb, there's an angel there, and the angel asks them why they are there. And then he tells them that Jesus has arisen from the grave. So this ritual probably originated in France. We know it was written into the what's called the Regularis Concordia, which is the monastic agreement by the English bishop Ethelwold between 965 and 975. So this became a acceptable part of liturgical dramatic performance. And probably liturgical drama reached a very elaborate peak by the 1300s and then began to become less active from that time on. Here's a performance of the Quim Quiritus ritual that I just described, and this is an example of that medieval liturgical drama that I spoke about, and you can watch this on your own time. So one of the things that I think is important to point out is that the very first playwright we have after the fall of Rome and then the beginning of the Middle Ages is actually a woman. The first playwright that we have is a woman named Roswitha of Gandersheim, also referred to as Roswitha. She was writing in the 10th century. She was a canoness. She was not a nun. She lived in a monastery of Gandersheim in what is now northern Germany. She wrote 6 plays modeled on the structure and some of the storytelling practices of the playwright Terence. If you remember, Terence was a major Roman playwright who came from North Africa and got freedom in Rome and then began writing comedies. But she didn't approve of the subject matter of Terence's plays, so she was inspired by him, but she wanted to write her plays about religious subjects. She liked Terence's writing style, but she felt his pagan standards were beneath her own. And her 6 plays were actually first published in 1501. She's the first known female playwright of Western dramatic literature post the classical age, and quite frankly, she's the first known playwright. So, as it says here, she's the first identifiable Western dramatist of the post-classical era. Another important female playwright of the time period was Hildegard von Bingen. She died in 1179. She was a Benedictine abbess, and she wrote a very famous Latin play with song called Ordo Virtutum, and it featured a struggle between personified virtues and forces of evil to gain a human soul. And Ordo Virtutum is a precursor of what would become the stories of the of the medieval morality plays, which often had to do with a human being or a human soul being torn between virtues and vices in their life. And here's a performance of the Ordo Virtutum, if you care to see that. The topics of medieval liturgical drama were related to many of the high points of Christian literature. Easter was important, especially the story of the three Marys going to the tomb of Jesus. Christmas, of course, the nativity scene, the raising of Lazarus from the dead, the conversion of Paul, the story of wise and foolish virgins, the story of the Pentecost, the story of Isaac and Rebekah, the story. Okay, so then we're breaking into the Old Testament, the story of Joseph and his brothers, Daniel and the lion's den, life events of the Virgin Mary, and stories about the Antichrist were topics of liturgical drama. Staging of liturgical drama had two primary parts. There were mansions, and these were basically small stages that were located scenes and housed props, and they would be placed within or near the or outside of a cathedral. There's the platea, that's the flat area that's surrounding these mansions on the stage, and sometimes the actors would get off the mansion and onto the floor level with the audience. The mansions would just be placed around the platea as needed, and performers would move from one mansion to the other as needed. The mansions differed in size and complexity. It could be very simple, like a simple altar to represent the tomb of Jesus, or it could be very, very complex, like there was an imitation of one of the of a sepulcher in Jerusalem in one of these performances. And there were sometimes curtains to reveal scenes and characters at particular moments. The choir loft sometimes might have been used to represent high places in heavens. Crypts in the churches might have been used to represent low places or hell. Flying machinery was used to pull the star ahead of the three kings as they followed it in a cathedral. And then there was one scene in which a dove was lowered, or flames were lowered to tell the Pentecost story. So the machinery in the churches became very elaborate, and in the 15th century, according to Bishop Abraham of Susdal, there was a play that showed Christ's ascension into heaven, and this is what he saw. He saw Christ raised upward with ropes and pulleys. Then Christ was engulfed in simulated clouds, and then Christ was reunited with angels in the heaven of God. And the platform he was performing on up there so high was about 50 feet above the church floor. So things could get very complex in liturgical drama. As far as costumes are concerned, people in liturgical dramas usually wore church vestments, and then other realistic or symbolic accessories would be added to these. Female characters would wear robes that covered their heads. Angels would have wings attached to them. Prophets and the three kings sometimes were given elaborate non-clerical garments. The props were primarily symbolic and were used to identify specific characters. The actors in liturgical drama were usually members of the clergy or choir boys. Some roles might have been taken by wandering scholars or schoolboys, and church manuals from this time period include notes on stage directions, especially those concerning movement, pantomime, and tone of voice. All the lines were in Latin in liturgical drama and were chanted rather than spoken. Acting in general was more stylized than realistic. There was sometimes comic liturgical drama, very rare, but there was an event called the Feast of Fools that lasted from the 12th to the 16th centuries, when it was declared unfit for the church anymore. The Feast of Fools was a celebration run by subdeacons of Catholic churches. It took place during the Feast of Circumcision, which happened on January 1st, or alternately January 6th or 13th. The event was notorious of several. It was the most notorious of several minor holidays during the Christmas season, dedicated to the minor clergy. The minor clergy conducted the services, and they staged processions throughout the town in the Feast of Fools, and they often collected or gifts or received payments from the public when they were running around. The Feast of Fools actually had a lot in common with earlier pagan festivals from the ancient and late antiquity era, and some scholars have linked the Feast of Fools with earlier pagan rites. And some of these things that were sort of reminiscent of the topsy-turvy pagan rites were that the clergy would ring the church bells incorrectly and sing out of tune on purpose during the Feast of Fool. The clergy would wear strange garments and masks, and they would walk around the service using puddings and sausages and old shoes instead of censers to, in other words, they replaced the incense in the service with that. And the whole service would be presided over by a bishop fool who assumed ecclesiastical authority on festival days. And sometimes the bishop fool was a child, actually. Cycle plays are a form of play that were produced outside of the church by citizens rather than by church members. And these plays were not in Latin. Cycle plays were in the common language. Now, the cycle plays I'm talking about here were those that were primarily performed in England starting in the 14th century. Cycle plays were associated with the Feast of Corpus Christi, and the feast varied in dates from May 21st to June 24th. The Corpus Christi cycle emphasized the redemptive power of the consecrated bread and wine of the Catholic Church, of the Eucharist ritual. The plays were meant to show the meaning of Christ through drama, and they included many events preceding Christ's birth, as well as those relating to his life, death, and resurrection, and finally the end of the world and the Last Judgment. The cycle plays were a series of Christian stories that included topics from the creation to the destruction of the world. And because there were so many stories to tell, cycle play festivals took several days to perform. And these were staged between 1350 and 1550 in the British Islands and on the European continent. Cycle plays were... in the British Isles were performed in various towns. So there was the York Cycle that had 48 plays as part of the cycle. Chester had 24 plays, and the Wakefield play had 32 plays. And then there are the in-town plays, called that because we don't quite know the name of the town, that had 42 plays in it. So these were festivals, these were cycles of plays that took a very long time to perform. And wherever cycle plays were performed, they drew on very similar subject matter. Usually there was God's ordering of existence as revealed in the Bible. There were apocryphal stories that were popular at the time, such as the story of Satan being thrown out of heaven and turning into a snake in the Garden of Eden. That's part of the apocryphal writing of the Bible. I mean, not of the Bible. It's not biblical. It's apocryphal writing. And then there are legends about biblical figures and saints, writings of the church fathers, collections of sermons. All of these materials fed into the plays that were performed in the cycle plays. So cycle plays had a lot in common with other religious medieval plays that were performed on the continent. It's very rare that there was a clear-cut cause and effect relationship among the various plays that were presented in the cycle. So one episode didn't necessarily have to have a clear, beyond just the theme, a clear connection to the next play that you saw. Episodic structures basically is what I'm talking about. So there's little attempt to bridge the gap between the various short plays that make up the long cycle. And there's a combination of stylization with realism. The stylization of these medieval religious plays was that there was rhyming verse, there was very little characterization, the characters were not very deeply designed, and there were mansion settings for each different location. The realism often had to do with convincing illusionistic special effects representing miraculous occurrences or torture. And then there were often comic events blended into it. So these usually involved devils, villains, or buffoons. Quite often you see a picture here of Jesus on the cross and two soldiers underneath. And often the two soldiers are making jokes and being comic underneath it. And this kind of heightens the brutality of the scene. So the comic scenes usually highlight human failings in the face of divine commandments or presence. And so they kind of reinforce the play's lesson. Most of the authors of the plays in these cycles are anonymous. We don't really know who wrote them. By the end of the 14th century, the cycle plays and other religious plays had, for the most part, passed out of control of the church. They were performed at religious festivals. They were produced by festivals of the town, especially members of craft guilds, which were kind of like our trade unions today. And any leader of a group of citizens might be involved in the production of these plays. And sometimes multiple towns would pool together resources to produce a play festival. There is a passion play in Lucerne, Switzerland, and its purpose was to honor God and glorify the city. And a city council committee at this passion play worked with the church, and the church reserved the right to approve the script. And so the church and the guilds and the city council worked together to create the ultimate passion play in many medieval non-religious performance situations. So the majority of work and expense for common language religious drama, and when I say common language, I mean not Latin, I mean the language spoken by most of the people where it's performed. The majority of work and expenses for such plays often fell to the craft guilds, and the production committee would specify fines for guilds that did not produce their plays or did not perform them well. So we know that sometimes was a problem. And each guild in a performance would provide a pageant wagon, scenery, costumes, props, special effects, actors, and supervisors. So this was a very big project. The number of actors required for productions varied. In England, where scenes were often performed on rolling stages, the plays, because of the size of the stage, each play staged by each guild included no more than 5 to 10 characters. On the European continent, where scenes were all played on a great big stage, casts were larger. So we know for a play called The Acts of the Apostle, performed at Bourges in 1536, 494 roles were distributed among 300 people. So that was a whole lot of people. That said, there could be many hundreds of people performing in the cycle plays in England. They were just divided up between these many different 42 to 39 plays that were being performed as part of one cycle. Most actors were drawn for the merchant class or the working class, and members of the clergy and nobility sometimes participated in role doubling. Actors playing more than one role was really very common in this time period. Most characters dressed in contemporary clothes, except for specialized costumes. So some of these were Roman soldiers would appear in medieval armor. Jewish high priests would dress sort of like the Catholic authorities, like a pope. Or a bishop. Jewish characters associated with Christianity, though historically Jewish, were dressed in Catholic clerical garb. Most other Jewish characters dressed in the clothes typical of medieval Jews, and God dressed as an emperor or pope, and angels wore church robes with wings attached to them. Some of the specialized costumes included devils. Devils were often giant birds of prey, monsters with animal heads, creatures with scales, tails, horns, or claws. That's how devils were often represented, just as we see them in medieval art. And in props, any character, human or divine, might carry an identifying emblem. So an Archangel Michael, for instance, always had a flaming sword. In Europe, not in England, so I'm distinguishing the European continent from England and from Ireland. So a large fixed stage was common on the European continent in places like France and Germany. Wagon rolling stages were common in England and in Ireland and areas like that. So on each day of the multi-day festival, the scenes for that day in an English show were mounted on wagon and presented in succession at a number of different places in the town, kind of like a parade. The wagons would be paraded through town, and some stages, some of these rolling stages had a small tiring house that offered a backstage, and some had equipment that allowed characters to be flown. There were two main playing spaces in England and on the European continent. So there was the mansion on which the actors stood, and then there was the open area, the platea. And in Europe, the platea would be the major stage that was elevated with many different mansions sitting on it. So if you look at this image here from a Valenciennes passion play from the 15th century, you'll see that these are various mansions. There's heaven on the left, and on the right side is hell, and between those are three other mansions, and these mansions are all places where the actors would perform, but if they stepped off that mansion onto the stage, they would be in the platea. So that's what this image shows you. Most wagon stages could only hold one mansion. Platform stages, as you see in this image, could hold quite a few. This is a very big platform stage in this illustration, and it has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 mansions, and it looks like another small piece of scenery that's a boat. This is a more close-up image of the Valenciennes Passion play. I'm sorry, it's from the 16th century. I said the 15th before, but it's from the 16th century. But it's a continuation of a medieval play that went into the Renaissance. Mansions on a platform stage might include heaven. It's usually placed at stage right from the actor's perspective. Really splendid in appearance. It's higher than all the other mansions. It has an earthly paradise at the base. Sometimes had very intricate turning spheres with torches to make them shine. It could open and close, and angels could be flown from heaven to scenes on the stage in the most elaborate of these. And hell was often presented as a hell mouth. You see here a picture of a hell mouth. And it's as terrifying as possible, with smoke and sulfur coming out of it and people being dragged into it when they die in passion plays with the hellmouth. Demons sometimes run out of the hellmouth and drag people into it. In the famous Herring of Hell scene, Christ comes and forces open the bars of the hellmouth and lets the characters from the good people from the Old Testament come out and go to heaven. And then there's always fire, smoke, and noise, and devils, and cries of the damned. And between heaven and hell on a platform stage, like in the Valenciennes image I showed you, there were the earthly locations. So we have a world in which heaven and hell are competing for the souls of human beings. And here, following for the rest of the slideshow, I just have some images. Here's a wagon stage for an English side view. Both the actor playing Christ and the character playing Satan are on the wagon stage, and in the next shot that I showed you, Satan is in the platea. He stepped off of the wagon. And so also here's just a list of some interesting medieval special effects. So we talked about flying. There were realistic beheadings and disembowelments. Trapdoors allowed sudden appearances and disappearances. There was a device that made a fig tree wither in one performance. Christ walked on water in a performance. Plenty of torture and execution scenes. There was a show, a character burned a bag of animal bones and entrails in order to, when I say that, what I mean, when a character was fake burned in a show, they simultaneously burned a bag of animal bones and entrails to create a realistic smell and look. So these are just some of the interesting things that happened in medieval theater. I hope you've enjoyed the presentation, and I encourage you to read all the materials carefully and go back through the slideshow on your own. It's on the website, and really study it.